Pilates. My name is Michael Miller. This is a Michael Miller trademark training video out to you because you're watching. Thank you and welcome. It's meant for Michael Miller Pilates licensed affiliates, the Core New Core, and anyone interested in surviving and thriving as a Pilates instructor, as well as anybody that just wants this particular point of view, whether they're teaching or not. The nature of these broadcasts, the flavor from which they're distilled continues to change. Number one, the spine corrector. The spine corrector. So, if you don't know what the spine corrector is, you still ought to be able to go to hermit.com and look up that piece of apparatus. So it's an apparatus. It's a classical piece of Pilates equipment, meaning it's something that he had and used in his studio. MMP makes sense. That's a long time saying mark of mine. Michael Miller Pilates makes sense. It makes sense from your mind, and it makes sense in your sensation. And that's what, to me, is great about Pilates, is that it's sensational in its nature, right? To where a student can come out of an effort and say, wow, I can feel that, or I could feel that. But the sensational nature. And what is this piece of equipment called the spine corrector? Now you go look up the shape and have a picture of it in your head or in front of you while I talk about it, because I'm not going to do it for you. For one thing, my spine corrector is not made of foam. It's made of wood, and it's larger in size than the nature of most spine correctors that you see out and around. But the key thing is that there's a place where there's where there's a curve and where there's a place to sit in. So, imagine why I'm placing my hands here for that. It's because at the hips, you sit in the spine corrector, and then it's about laying your back over the spine corrector. No, that's about it. No, it's about learning to articulate at the hips. It's about learning how to reach your back into the surface that rises up to meet it, so that it's sensational. There, I said that well. The surface of the spine corrector is a smooth curve that rises up so that the back, so that the back can easily find contact with the surface. And the trick is to learn how to have more of a grip at the hip in order to make that contact sooner than later. And that brings to mind this great, so this is a whip, in case you can't figure that out. And the handle is rigid, and the handle here is the sacrum of the spine. So right here is the bony structure that allows the musculature to take a grip at the hips. Right? That's so extraordinary to recognize the shape of the skeletal structure reinforces the grip being reached for there at the hips. And so all too often we can just end up rolling our hips forward and letting the weight of our body sit on our lower spine, right? And in so sitting, it's tough to make rotation around to get this to actually roll in that direction. It's literally named the spine corrector because it literally corrects the way one holds and one articulates one's spine. Of Joe's original footage, him doing spine corrector, I've seen bits and pieces of that go out there on social media. The good news is that that pattern shows up in his flow of movement on a spine corrector, in the exercises that he does on the spine corrector, and the order that he does them in the flow that they're done in, right? They're consistent with everything else, which is flexion, extension, side bending, rotation, torsion, which is straight legs before bent knees. That's an important one. I always think of an old TV Western series called Gunsmoke, and the deputy had a bum leg, he had a stiff leg, and how it didn't prevent him from getting around, it just did it awkwardly because he didn't have the blessed articulation of that joint at the knee. And so if we are moving from control, inside to outside, from what's easiest to control to what's more difficult to control, then in all of the leg spring series, say on a caddy or off of a springboard, the pattern still is straight legged before bent knee. And then once capable of both, straight leg, bent knee kind of thing. Pattern, spine corrector. And so the spine corrector changes the relationship of the body to the floor so the body can go into or reach for extension in a supine position, into something that you can relax into and not just arcing your spine dramatically on the floor. See what I'm saying? And that is so savory of the character of Pilates being something that you really can release into in order to go closer to your core to control. Spine corrector. So part of what this spine corrector is correcting is your ability to articulate at the hips and to articulate the grip that exists in your sacrum. So this part of the whip is this part of your spine, and then as you control the rigid part, the rest works dynamically off of that, from the more rigid to the less rigid, from closer to center to further away from center. And so the spine corrector evolved as a piece of apparatus to where different dimensions of curve could be used. And that came from all in the same base. But I have dedicated spine corrector, half barrel, quarter barrel. What's the smallest barrel in the studio? The foot corrector. And there too, there's that sense of being able to find release in a smooth curve, in the hopes of finding elongation and dynamic tension to maintain that when the support goes away. Number two. In a recent Romana clip, it's presented as a warm-up, what she does. And what she does is, to me, the wall and some of the standing footwork and the towel, all condensed into something labeled by the editors or the producers of the video clip as being a warm-up. And I was surprised at that, and I'm not saying it's wrong and it can't be. I'm just saying that as an instructor, the wall has been a frequent ending of mine for a session or for a group if you have enough wall space. And the reasons I had were because when you come away from the wall, you come away standing, right? You come away at the end of the push-up on the mat, standing. And in a position to walk away, go pay for your session if you haven't already, and schedule another one. As a transition, we all like transitions because transition is so much of the original work that we see. And we realize that because it's so much more effective. And the wall is that kind of transition of, boy, you're standing up now, you're all open, and you've got it, and now take that away with you and float down the steps after you pay and schedule for another session. And then from a real practical point of view, you make the last apparatus that they interact with, that they're taking sensation from, isn't a spine corrector where it's all nifty and you're curling your hips to find more control closer to your sacrum in articulating your spine. This is all just general stuff. Do this with your doctor or with doctor's permission or with qualified help. But I'm not saying anything other than very simply being able to move your hips in a way that gives you the control of a whip on the rest of the whip, of the handle on the rest of the whip. Recognize that. Or at least that's my point of view of it. And then see, in terms of ending with the wall, you're ending on a piece of equipment that you're sending your student out into the world in which that piece of equipment exists almost everywhere, right? So that they know how to interact with a door jamb or a section of wall. If they just want to try to pull together what they work so hard on developing during their hour of concentration, what is all that? And that's where I have to break right into MMP and say, doing the wall is good for you no matter what, but when you see Romana curling on somebody to make their ears pull up toward the ceiling, right? You understand the biomechanics of that. Which goes beyond traditional contemporary, conventional, right, to something else. That's why it's transcendent. So those are good reasons why, and just sharing with you, presented as a warm-up, I don't know, because there's so much out in the open. There's so much away from all of the graces that are possible. If you have a reformer, if you have Cadillac or Wall Springs or whatever, where the body is grounded, starting with the body grounded on the wall, has the load automatically presumed suspended in load. I'm pretty sure I meant what I said by that, but it may make no sense on a rewind. But that's why I'm bringing it up, is because I saw it go by, introduced as an introduction, and in the brief time that I spent studying with Romana in a teacher training course, I never saw her introduce it as an intro. Not saying you can't, and I'm just saying that what I used it for was an extra on the way out. Now that you know that it's been introduced in two different ways, hopefully it allows you to evaluate how it feels using it as either, so that you can choose for your circumstance. Being a Pilates instructor is a response to observation. That's why a Pilates instructor job doesn't start until you see movement, because then the corrective feedback loop is possible where you can cue to take that movement somewhere that it wasn't going. And here's a place where it's like, okay, now it doesn't happen exactly the way you wanted. Give the student a chance to work it out for themselves. Because they do. I do. It's just barely enough to do a rough effort. And that takes you deeper into your performance. Let a student go a second time to see if what mattered most to you is still an issue. And if it is, then on the third time, it's time to get in there and take it where you'd like to see it go. The point is, allow the student to work it out for themselves. Number 3, don't be a sheep. Don't be a sheep is comes from my Facebook world, where someone asks to be a friend, and I usually see if they have some kind of connection to Pilates to accept that kind of invitation. And they knew a couple of people that I knew were Pilates people, and they had some Pilates stuff on their site. So, and I went looking for what else was there. No, I went looking just to see if there was Pilates stuff there, meaning, is this a basis for a good friendship? And there was a comment or written word about a deceased contemporary of mine, and how his message to the person writing this memory was don't be a sheep. Don't be a sheep. And I thought, wow, I'm sorry that I missed out on sharing passion with that instructor, because that's a good takeaway. That's a good thing to have been remembered by. And it made me feel all the better about accepting the friendship, being someone that admires being told not to be a sheep. Number 4, lying down, sitting up, sitting on a chair, and then where? Okay. So all I'm doing is making commentary on stuff I see go by on social media to hopefully give you some kind of comparison or distinction that helps you recognize the buoy of MMP insofar as knowing where you are or where something else is relative to it. Okay? Lying down, sitting up, sitting on a chair is the fundamental progression of the body on the reformer in its pursuit of controlling itself out there in the world, in its pursuit of controlling the entire sequence. An intermediate subset of that sequence is often presented. And so in what I saw go by as presented as intermediate, I was pretty much there all along until stomach massage wasn't there in terms of looking at the sequence. See, what do people look at? They identify with their ability to anticipate the sequence, because that gives them control by knowing what comes next as a student or an observer. And so things picked up in familiarity until the stomach massage showed up somewhere to me that seemed reminiscent of where it comes beyond intermediate. So there's this shifting of the exercises. It's really quite eloquent. And it's a worthy discussion of how the reformer sequence evolves, and seeing an intermediate reformer sequence where the stomach massage comes later than from lying down to sitting up to sitting on a chair, meaning whatever you're doing lying down on the reformer, for instance, footwork and hundreds, from wherever you go there, it's sitting up. And as a beginner, it's into stomach massage to intermediate, and then beyond intermediate, when you let go of stomach massage there, rowing takes over. See, so the sitting up movement changes, but the position of the body in the evolution doesn't. That way too deep there, or too much detail, or not enough, and obvious as all get out. So what I'm pointing out is the stomach massage and how it relates to you lie down and you gain control lying flat on your back, supine. And then if you have that, you sit up and then challenge your control sitting on the floor or on the reformer, which is effectively on the floor, right? And if you can control that, you move to the short box and sit up on a chair. This is just my point of view, MMP, and all of the documentation that exists on the web at hermit.com. what matters for you is to survive as a Pilates instructor, I think, is for you to understand the underlying structure of the ideal in Joe's original work, no matter what else there is, or influence, or direction, or impression, or whatever. Because to the extent that the ideal point of view has real consequences, it's what we're after as a Pilates instructor, to be efficient. You know, now where's my thing again? Excuse me for the noise. I have a funnel. Right? If you haven't already, print out the list of the reformer at different levels of difficulty or inclusion. They're all difficult at different levels of inclusion, or at different levels of that in which capacity is required. Use highlighters to carry through what's consistent. Learn the order. Learn the order of the original work is what I'm saying. And then compare your version of the original with other versions of the original. And from that consistency and what you see that doesn't change, hopefully there'll be enough for you to recognize the pattern within. In this case, I'm pointing to starting out lying down and then sitting up and then sitting up off of the floor, right? And I'm talking at an intermediate level. I wanted to avoid pulling my blow-ups of my list that are next door in my studio and having them here in front of me. But it's going to take that if we're going to have that kind of discussion. And if you want to be prepared for that, have your own list printed out. Your list from your lineage and the other lineage you expose yourself to, and what exists in some book and what exists on different websites, and all of those 10,000 points of view. Use MMP to navigate your way as a Pilates instructor. I think human nature is what it is, and the more I've come to appreciate human nature through reading Lee Child novels, really, because he uses it a lot to guide his perspective as a writer, or of his character, in evaluating human nature. It becomes much easier when you recognize there is human nature, and that your ability to identify it helps you survive. So the MMP point of view is about what exists with Joe's original work, and core new tension is about what biomechanically just exists as their human nature, within their human nature. Core new tension exists within your human nature, all human beings. Now, if they're severely handicapped in some way that they're missing enough of their being, it doesn't mean that the being that they're based upon doesn't have a human nature in the way it interacts with the physics that it finds itself in. I think I think it's human nature. There we go. It's human nature to have very guarded, or guarded's a good word. Very guarded um, thoughts of, or embodiment of movement at the hips. And I think that's a whole sexuality thing. And maybe I'm completely wrong in this and completely naive, but when um, and I can say this from experience, a Pilates instructor understands the physics regardless of 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 what's alluded to or even pointed at directly. And what by experience I mean, some of my students have been of religions where they've been in a job and you don't see much or any of their body, right? And there's no tactile cueing. But it doesn't mean you can't point to at least, perhaps, I don't know, that may not be worth, see, and that's why you can only teach people to come to you, because to try to go out and press what you view on others, they'll find offense at something, right? And I mean none. I'm trying to point out that it's, the human body is such a sacred thing and revered in so many ways by humanity and religions and cultures that there's as much that goes unsaid as goes said. But here too, see, no matter the clothing and no matter what you can use visually for inspiration, there is always the sensation that as an instructor I'm trying to deliver, where a student can say, "Oh, I can feel that," or "Yeah," or they can discern for themselves, right? And that alone is a very narrow part of the slice of the Pilates pie, the slice that takes the student out, the teacher out of the primacy of the student. The teacher decides everything, to the teacher just pulls back the curtain and lets the student make sensational judgment for themselves. So I've talked in the past about mystery and the unknowable. Never be good enough. Never see clearly enough. Always there'll be artifacts in the attic that you won't be privy to. And you like it that way. I mean, it's possible to like it that way. It's possible to approach the whole thing that way. If it weren't, so much of the Pilates culture wouldn't be that way. My suggestion to you is to be seamless and transparent in the midst of that projection, and acknowledge that, yeah, there's a whole lot of mystery going on and a whole lot of unknowable going on in the human's interaction with reality. It's just that there's clarity to be had that makes the mystery and the unknowable all the more tangible, all the more intriguing. You know, I had a comment from someone on Facebook that, you know, it was just a very specific example of before and after pictures, and then she said, Pilates is changing this person's life. And what does that mean, and why is that, and who are you in that dance with that, right? Because again, it's holding the curtain back and giving a person what? Control. And a lot of that is through the understanding of where they're going when they dive in. Telling them what to listen to, what to discern. And Pilates exists at a level where the teacher just gives the instructions, right? And that's as far as it goes. And maybe sometimes I teach that way, but only when no opportunity presents itself. Although I can't imagine that being the case. So all I'm trying to do there is point out a difference. You can treat a student. The student wants to chase the ball. Now you can just toss the ball and make instructions, and they'll chase, and they will merrily chase it until you're out of time. And actually, they'll chase it in earnest. Here we go up the mountain, all full of vim and vigor, and you deliver that, but your student then starts peaking. And as an instructor, if you keep going up when your student is peaking, you're not paying attention. You know, you're doing this, but and then you're doing that. You lead the way. There's never a loss of face in the session, and there's just you being out ahead of the normal progression that a student goes through in the way they make their effort. So don't be a sheep. And when you see equipment, wow, that's great. Remember that all of the classical equipment that Joe used resonates with Joe's mat, which MMP defines as uniform eccentric loading flowing through progressive patterns of movement. Now there's all the 10,000 other things, but to the extent that you know that and can state that definition word for word, it's the next best thing to knowing Joe's definition word for word. Because you have Joe's definition, and you have and you have a definition of the ideal. It doesn't matter where it came from. But just the point of view that there's an ideal in Dunbar Hills, that's transcendent. That goes someplace different. That's what makes MMP neoclassical. It doesn't deny classical as classical, but to the extent that classical only teaches what it knows classically, from my point of view, that's a focus on historical reenactment. Like they do of famous battles. You're taking a body as a student, you're taking a human being into the most fundamental efforts to control one's self in space. And self is a good word because within that I can consider being, thinking, and observing. Because it's in those three capacities that the Pilates instructor fulfills his purpose to help a student coordinate those three. And it's not a someday thing. It's not about, if you're good enough, someday you'll be, there's very subtle presumptions in place to secure income stream and prestige, and that's human nature all over. Yours and mine, all of that. But when embodiment is the ultimate authority, there's a connection to Pilates that's available to anyone that is willing not to be a sheep. Life can't live forever. Read between the lines. The lines, lines could be lists, L-I-S-T-S, orders of things, lists, right? Go to hermit.com and print out my list so that you have them in case my website goes away. And compare how my lists go through levels. And then go somewhere else. Well, see, most people only have their list within their school, and that whole thing is access by right of going to that school. But compare the list you got if you got certified by some school to my lists. Not that my lists are better or more accurate, but just the comparison of the lists might give you insight as to why Joe's work was structured the way it was, and may be visible to you in ways that others have never considered seeing. Read between the lists. Maybe that'll change it to that, but I don't think so. Life can't live forever. Read between the lines. See behind the curtain. Add to and to. Direct your thinking. Geist.